Welcome to Lecture 14.1, in which we will begin discussing the theory of evolution. This is a portrait of Charles Darwin, who is considered the father of evolutionary theory. This is Alfred Russel Wallace, who may be less well known, but independently came to the same conclusions that Charles Darwin did about evolution and natural selection. They published their ideas jointly in 1858. Our learning objectives for this video are to describe the history of evolutionary thought, evaluate natural selection as a mechanism of biological evolution, describe the modern synthesis, and compare and contrast microevolution and macroevolution, which we will continue doing in the next video. Evolution can be defined as the process through which characteristics within a species change, and over time, how new species arise. It is also not linear, but branched. Many of you have likely seen the illustration of what looks like a monkey becoming a human over time. However, that is not accurate. We did not evolve from monkeys. Instead, we shared a common ancestor with them long ago, but branched into distinct lineages as you see here. The theory of evolution is considered to be a unifying theory of biology that explains the diversity of life and many other biological phenomena. I want to stress that in the context of science, a theory is not just a guess or idea about how something can be explained, but an explanation based on observations and hypotheses that have been rigorously tested over and over again and supported. It is ultimately the framework on which biologists build their hypotheses and predictions about the living world, whether they are studying molecular biology or ecology. Darwin and Wallace were not the first to come up with the idea of evolution, although they were the first to propose natural selection as the mechanism. There have been written ideas about evolution as far back as 500 BC. But the first fully formed explanation was by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who proposed inheritance of acquired characteristics. This is the idea that individuals acquire different traits in their lifetime and can pass these traits down to their offspring. The most commonly used example is a giraffe wanting to eat something high up on a tree, so it stretches its neck out, making it longer. The lengthening of the neck is passed down to offspring until there is one that has a long enough neck to reach the tree. While this idea was ultimately discredited, and we now know that changes in our somatic cells cannot be passed down, it was still an important influence on evolutionary ideas. As mentioned, the idea of evolution by natural selection was independently conceived by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Their ideas were ultimately developed through the observations they made during their voyages around the world. Darwin went through South America, Australia, the southern tip of Africa, and the Galapagos Islands, while Wallace went through Brazil and the Malay archipelago. It was at the Galapagos Islands that Darwin made his famous observation about finch beak shape. He saw that different finch species found on each island were similar, but had distinct differences. In particular, he noted that there was a graded series of beak sizes and shapes, with very small differences between the finches with the most similar beak sizes. As he wrote in his book, it was as if there had originally been one small group of birds, and each one was modified with different traits to be able to take advantage of the resources found on the island they were on. While Wallace and Darwin both made similar observations and provided similar explanations, Darwin was the one who coined the term natural selection. But what exactly does natural selection mean? Natural selection is the idea that individuals with traits that are more favorable for the environment they are in are more likely to survive, and therefore also more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits to offspring. An example of natural selection over the course of a generation is finches on the Daphne major before and after a drought. These finches have variation in beak size, with some having smaller beaks and some having larger beaks. Prior to the drought, the average beak size was about 9.5 millimeters. However, after the drought, the number of small soft seeds reduced much more drastically than the number of large hard seeds. This meant that of the surviving birds, the ones with larger beaks were better able to survive and reproduce. A year later, the average beak size went up to a little over 10 millimeters. Ultimately, natural selection requires for there to be variation and genetic diversity, such as a variation in beak size. Over the course of several decades, the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory has been developed. The modern synthesis is essentially a synthesis of our understanding of evolution and genetics. Specifically, it is the idea that natural selection and other evolutionary processes can lead to changes in genetics of a population, which in turn leads to the gradual evolution of populations and species over time. Microevolution refers to evolution on a smaller scale, and how gene frequencies within a population of a species can gradually change over time. Macroevolution refers to evolution on a larger scale, and how over the course of generations, the gradual changes can give rise to new species with their own distinct characteristics. In this video, we learned that while the idea of evolution has been around for a long time, modern ideas of evolution arose in the 1800s, and inheritance of acquired traits was one of the first proposed but ultimately disproved mechanisms. Later on, Darwin and Wallace proposed what would be known as natural selection, which is the idea that individuals with traits beneficial for the environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits. As we will later learn, this is one of several mechanisms that drive evolutionary change. The modern synthesis was later developed to join together knowledge that was developed in evolution and genetics. It proposes that evolutionary processes, such as natural selection, drive changes in genetics, and these genetic changes lead to changes in population traits and species over time. In the next video, we will discuss microevolution and macroevolution. Thanks for watching.